Mr. Chairperson, we received an email from the other board member that they will not be here today. When the red light is off, it's on, so there's a button right there in the front that if you press. There you go.
Now I'm on. All right, here we go. All right, everybody, welcome to the Joint Powers Authority Board meeting, September 24th, 2020. If you'll please join me in a salute to the flag of our nation. It's behind me here. Here we go. Ready? Salute, pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic
For which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible,
with liberty and justice for all.
Let's merge that. Anyway, I'll be quiet. Okay. First, do we have any public comment on the consent agenda? Anything come in by email or otherwise?
Mr. Chairperson, I have not received any public comments for this meeting.
Would any of the board members like to pull something on a consent agenda?
No.
Okay, no interest in that? You good, Janet?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
All right. Will somebody make a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I'll move we approve.
Okay, Bill, or Mr. Bynum, and the councilwoman made a second. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Nay. Okay, passes unanimously. So on our regular business, our first thing, the item number 3, it's a groundwater sustainability plan status. This is for information. Is that you?
Yes. We're getting,
Paul Goslin.
there we go. We're getting the presentation up. So this first item will be a standing item updating the status of the plan. I had a more detailed presentation at the last meeting. This one is going to be fairly brief. Oops. There we go. There we go. So in the next agenda item, I'll be talking about the basin setting chapter, which is near completed. And that's going to be a major cornerstone of the groundwater sustainability plan. And what we're beginning now, as we're sitting here in September, staring down October to April, the next 8 months is going to start to develop the sustainable management criteria about where do we want the basin to be at the end of 40 years to be sustainable, how we're going to use our monitoring network and identify representative monitoring wells to determine the performance on our goals that we set. Another project I want to make note of is interbasin coordination. We're working with all the adjoining subbasins through a facilitated discussion on making sure that how other adjoining GSAs are dealing with interbasin flows, so we're not dealing with assumptions that are going the other way, and we're dealing apples to apples and not apples to oranges. And you'll hear more of that probably towards the end of the calendar year. And then, again, project and management actions, those things we're going to do to make sure we achieve the sustainability goals that we set in the sustainable management criteria. So from April to September, we'll start to package up the all those chapters that we work on till next April. And again, those chapters are going to come out in draft. You'll hear preliminary information on them. There'll be a public comment period. And then in April, we'll start to compile them into a cohesive package for GSP. And again, that entire package will then go through a public comment period. And I did have a wrong date in there, but that'll be in the summer. And then September to December will really be final public hearings and consideration by the board for adoption. So that's really the schedule in a nutshell. There's ample time in there for a lot of iteration, a lot of discussion and direction as we move through. So I'll open up for any questions or discussion. I will add one thing, even though we're on schedule and this wasn't on the agenda, the Wyandotte GSA board in September sent a letter to the governor asking for an extension, a 2-year extension for submission, even though the GSP is on track. With COVID, the public engagement through the Stakeholder Advisory Committee had to go virtual, like we've had to with a lot of our meetings, and the stakeholders felt, although we're making the best of it, there's a facilitated, professional facilitator running the meetings. Meetings have been canceled, but the online format isn't really conducive to public engagement. So there was a request to do that. We had talked about that, and I'd leave it up to the board whether to bring that forward. We didn't think because of our circumstances it was applicable at this point, because we are going to be doing webinars and public workshops, but we wanted to bring that to your attention.
Any public comment on this matter?
Mr. Chairperson, it doesn't seem that there's anyone out there in the hallway, and I did not receive any written communication on this item.
Okay, well, I have to ask because any board comment or questions? Janet?
I have no comment. I have no comment. Thank you.
I think we're just setting a schedule, and I will comment that we haven't had a great public interest, and so I think pushing it back 2 years is not necessary. They haven't.
And that would require legislation and opening up the law and.
Not this, we're just gonna be it. We're just gonna have to work hard, the way it looks. Okay, we're gonna move on to discussion of draft basin setting chapter.
Yes, thank you. So the draft basin setting chapter, again, this is the scientific foundation for the groundwater sustainability plan. It also included the monitoring chapter, which describes our monitoring program and network. So again, this is a component of all the sections that need to be completed. The basin setting is a major component. So it does include the hydrologic conceptual model. That's really our understanding of how the basin works, current historical groundwater conditions, water budget, and then management areas and monitoring networks. So we drafted with the consultant team of David's Engineering, working through the management committee, we prepared the draft basin setting chapters and held a webinar on June 23rd. And that was actually quite a good turnout. I think we might have had 30 or 40 people online, and a lot of good questions and comments. So it was a pretty good engagement. And so staff took those comments back and the consultants and reworked and cleaned up the completed draft. And that draft went out for a public comment period from August 8th to September 8th. There were no comments received, but the issues that were raised in the webinar were addressed in the revised draft. So one thing when we do put these drafts up, and there were concerns about if people didn't have time to review them or they thought of other things, all these chapters are going to remain draft until you approve the final GSP. Because as I went through the other presentation, the entire compilation of the GSP is going to go back out for public comment, and it might bring some issues as you start bringing these pieces together. Other things may come up once the whole pitch is put together that you may not see. So having a comment period later and keeping the public engaged is going to be very important. So I'm going to walk through the highlights of the basin setting, because it will set the stage for discussions and presentations you're going to hear on sustainable criteria and project and management actions. So the basin setting chapter does include monitoring data, the data that we have been collecting in the basin. As you see, largely it's been a pretty stable basin over the years. We do have groundwater contour levels based upon the monitoring data we have and the level of groundwater. And then really the big thing is starting to develop the water budgets. The water budgets, it's all-encompassing. It talks about like your checking account, how much is coming in, how much is going out over time, and you'll have in different, spans of a month, you'll have your checking account go up and down depending upon when bills come in and you get paid or have income. So it will have fluctuations over time. Water budgets are not much different, but there's a lot of variables that go into it. And we have been using the Butte Basin groundwater model, which encompasses the 3 subbasins we have in the county. So the land use is also something that was addressed up to 2018. Agriculture is the 26% of the land use in the subbasin. Developed is about 20%, and then native, which is undeveloped or open space, doesn't have managed water on it per se. It's about half the subbasin. Precipitation, as you can see, it's been highly variable, and as we'll explain later, it's been a fairly dry period, 2000 to 2018. And I should reference when we're talking, we'll get into the water budget of the historic water budget. We chose a period, they require that you choose a 10-year period. We chose a period from 2000 to 2018 as sort of indicative of the current historic, if you will, water budget. It also turns out, and you'll see this, is that period is among the driest periods that this region has seen in centuries. Water supplies, again, surface water supplies is about 20%, and then groundwater pumping mostly is agricultural pumping. There is some residential or urban pumping also that is included. And as you can see in the dry years, 2014, 2015, more groundwater pumping, particularly by ag, than typical otherwise surface waters because you had cutbacks because of the drought. So this is one of the things that occurs. You'll have less precipitation going in and more pumping during dry years, and that really drives down groundwater levels during droughts. Deep percolation is also, and this gets into understanding recharge. Again, during those drought years, a lot less percolation going in. One of the things that we do need to evaluate is surface water, groundwater interaction. One of the aspects we need to address is assuring that we're not having stream depletion of interconnected surface waters. So that's evaluated. Generally, we're looking at water moving from the groundwater up into the streams. That's indicative of fairly stable groundwater conditions. Interbasin and boundary flows is another aspect, is part of the basin setting. And again, this is part of the project. We'll be having discussions. We've started dialogues with other adjoining subbasins on what they are construing for their interbasin. And if you look at, for example, the North Yuba, looking that we have 7,000 acre feet, groundwater flow towards Yuba, we want to make sure that they're not having the arrow go the other way and a different direction. So it's making sure that, as GSAs use different technical pieces, that we're at least in the same order of magnitude and direction of interbasin groundwater flow, and to try to resolve those issues early on rather than when the plan's done and have to reopen things, open things up. Because again, there's one aspect of the law that requires that one agency's plan can't impede another agency's plan from achieving their goals. So this has to be worked out early on. And then the historic water budget. Again, this is the land and water system on the left, and the groundwater system on the right with the inflows and outflows. So the summary of this is for 2018 to 2000 to 2018, there was a loss of storage over time. And this kind of really demonstrates the wet and dry years. As we get into more wet years and out of drought, it kind of resolves itself. But since 2006. We've had a series of very dry years, some of the most critical dry years in history, and groundwater storage has decreased. And again, this is another compilation of change in storage. And this will also be translated into change in groundwater levels, which will be pretty commensurate with the change in storage. So just a real recap of the historic water budget. And again, this is 2000 to 2018. Primary land use was native vegetation. There's a real strong use of groundwater, reliance on groundwater. But really the driver for the change in groundwater storage appears to be driven by the historic drought in this drought period rather than huge changes in groundwater pumping. Now, this gets into, and I'm copying a lot of the slides that were presented on June 23rd. One, because not just because it was easy, but because the technical people put this together and I want to rely on their expertise. But the current conditions, and this kind of changes, we went to 1971 to 2018 for the hydrology, and we used 2015, 2016. So these are all the background parameters. And then we built in future conditions. We took into account the general plan for the county, the general plan for Oroville, as if those were fully built out. There were some assumptions made about growth in agriculture. So this really led us to sort of what the future looks like. And then we also factored in climate change. There were a number of climate change models that we could rely on, but we chose the central tendency for climate change scenarios, both for 2030 and 2070. So the historic hydrology that was over this period, you can see that the most recent period has been fairly dry, but we've had a series of wet and dry periods. Interesting enough, although we've seen this period be very dry, going back to 1906, we're pretty comparable to that record from 1906 to 2018. So current conditions, future conditions, there is estimated change in acreage. Agriculture will stay roughly the same. Developed land will increase from just 9,600 acres to 16,500 acres. And again, this is estimates based upon the general plans, and native vegetation would be reduced from that. During the webinar, there was discussion that this might actually underestimate the increased ag acreage, mostly on the east side. So that's something we're going to take into account and analyze those aspects.
I think that's warranted because we're seeing more irrigation-dependent crops, permanent crops, trees, and we should look at that carefully. And it's increased dramatically in the last few years.
Yeah.
Right, Bill? You live out there.
Yes, dramatically.
Yeah. So we might be underestimating. And just as a follow-up, how many test wells do we have actually in our basin at this time, and how many more do we plan to put in?
Yeah, we have, and Kelly was going to touch on this. We do have the one.
And later report?
Yes.
Then we'll just wait.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, climate change scenarios. And this was the options we had to deal with. We chose the 2030 and 2070 central tendency. And as you can see, other agencies did essentially the same. There was issues about doing 2070 drier with extreme warming or 2070 with wetter and more moderate warming. What these do, these climate change scenarios, do give you sort of a estimation of what may occur. So they're not determinants that you need to match exactly what those show, but kind of give you an idea as to what the stress will be under climate change scenarios to help you gauge your management decisions in choosing your sustainable criteria. What was somewhat surprising and why we took a closer look at this is because of where we're located in California, under the climate change scenarios, we're going to have warmer and wetter periods under climate change. So you can actually see precipitation is estimated to increase under the climate change scenarios. But we're also finding it will be warmer, which means also there's more demand from crops for water, and that gets into the increased ET values. We're also going to be facing, with that wetter and warmer, you're going to have impact on the snowpack. You're going to have the snowpack coming off a lot earlier, and that's going to affect recharge, and we've started to see that. We're also seeing, even though this is average over that period, you're going to see a greater extent of the extremes that we've been experiencing the last couple of decades. So those severe droughts and those severe wet periods are just going to continue and exacerbate. So even though over the long haul it'll look fairly comparable to what we have, the extremes are just going to really drive our future. Again, these were just some of the scenarios and some of the references that we used. And I will say, as the plan, and this got brought up last time, every 5 years we're going to take a look and update the plan with new numbers. So as land use changes may change, or we may find changes in agricultural land going in, or better data on groundwater or climate change, we will modify this plan to see if we are going to continue to protect the beneficial uses of groundwater that are in the plan. So land use changes, there were some increased in developed land. You'll see that on the right-hand side in green, mostly taken by native vegetation. And agriculture was largely stayed the same. And again, this is going to change drivers and water supplies, and precipitation and recharge. So again, deep percolation is driven by changes in land use and precipitation, and the precipitation is going to be one of the major drivers. Again, so looking over the long haul under the different growth scenarios, the future with climate change, the two scenarios or without climate change are fairly comparable, and the change in storage is negligible over time. As you can see, the historic condition, and we got commented that these titles are somewhat confusing, but the historic, again, was 2000 to 2018. So that really shows this past 18-year period was one of the drier periods that we've experienced. If you go over a longer term period, with or without climate change, it's not as severe, and it results in no net storage. But what we'll see in this busy graph shows the different scenarios that are fairly comparable, but you're going to have over time some pretty big wet and dry periods that are really going to drive the decisions on how we manage the basin to avoid undesirable results to, let's say, domestic wells and creeks and streams. During those very dry years, you're going to have potentially some negative impacts that we'll need to address. So really the summary of the draft water budget scenario was slight increased urbanization. Climate changes may increase the precipitation and ET demands, and surface water inflows, again, from the earlier snowpack runoff. Modest net stream accretion, the gains, they're going to be done from groundwater. And the variability is going to be pretty pronounced over a 50-year condition. And that's irregardless whether we use climate change scenarios or which climate change scenario we end up using. And then in the end, there's limited reduction in groundwater storage. So really, it's turning into what's driving the picture. Looks like it's going to be driven by drought, and particularly the dry period. So that's going to probably gauge how we craft responses to the data, looking at essentially drought resiliency for our long-term sustainability. And again, monitoring, we're going to need to improve monitoring to better understand water budgets. Let's get back to your question too about monitoring data. We do definitely need more monitoring data over time to better understand basin conditions. So that's a very quick recap of the basin setting. If there's questions or issues that you'd have, it's remaining a draft, but it's going to be modified over time. We're accepting comments at any point, but the basin setting is going to provide the starting point for the discussions on sustainable criteria, which you'll hear about in the next couple months about, okay, with this data, what does this show for impacts to, let's say, domestic wells, ag wells, groundwater-dependent ecosystems and the like, and what sort of actions, and that may drive some discussions on actions to avoid those undesirable results.
Questions or comments by the
I have a
board?
comment. It doesn't really matter, I think, whether it's drought or groundwater pumping that results in the table getting lower. It's still getting lower, and that's a real concern for me. My other concern is every year is our hottest year, and these droughts have been forecast to get worse and worse from everything that I've read. And so I think we really need to pay attention to the fact, if you go back and compare 1908 to 2018, whatever, that's apples and oranges now. It's not going to go back to that. It's going to be more like from 2000 to 2020, and it's going to be exacerbated. And so I would keep a critical eye on that and be very cautious about that. And I think these monitoring wells are going to be critical, and we need to keep an eye on them and really take it from 2000 on. That's my feelings about it.
Do you have a comment?
No. Interesting.
Do you have a comment? No?
I have no comment.
I agree with Bill. I think that's what we're here to do. We're going to set a baseline, but I'm again worried about how our monitoring wells are dispersed so we get the most accurate data and the best science to put our baseline down. And I think going forward, the biggest users of water will always be agriculture. They'll be forced to, depending on how we set that baseline, depending on what we see, they're going to have to just really get modern in the technology they use to irrigate with. Mm-hmm. I think it's not the end of the world. You just have to, we may be irrigating like Saudi Arabia or, Israel is really good at reusing and keeping their water usage really tight on agriculture. So it's important, again, repeat myself, the more science we have, the better it is. And because we're going to be the ones doing it. And, in the end, I'll make another comment. If we find there is declining water, they're going to put it, that's why the state did this, they're going to put on the locals to decide how we stop that decline. So, which I won't go into. But
And-
I could fill the room by saying we could put meters on wells, but I didn't say that.
You'll get the room filled if you do that.
Yeah.
And I think too, that's an important point. We do have 20 years to implement where we want the basin to be. So in addition to submitting the plan, we have to identify the additional data we need in the plans to address that, and a timeline to implement the path, whether it's conservation measures or other technologies or recharge projects or whatever. And there is going to be monies available. DWR has a proposal out for each sub-basin, $2 to $5 million for implementation, and that could cover additional data, additional wells, and projects and actions. So we will get a jump start on on going down that path. So the submission on January 2022 won't be the end. It'll just be the start of what we're going to build on when we submit this plan.
Yeah, I've got one more
Go ahead.
comment.
That's what we're here for.
I think we all know people who've had to drill another well. I know Dave Garcia in Yankee Hill, for instance. And so I'd be interested in what data we have on what are the depth of wells, domestic versus agricultural wells, versus, I guess, municipality wells. But anyway, I'd like to be able to see that so we know how close we are to forcing residential areas to have to maybe put in a new well or something like that.
Yeah, and that data will be coming as part of the sustainable management criteria. That'll be key data.
So just,
Councilwoman?
when we flew, out of curiosity, when we flew this basin, is it a monolithic basin or is it, several different actual basins? Because, I have governments, we're called the Wyandotte Creek.
Right.
But it's not just this monolithic
Yeah,
water
no.
table, right? So again, that points to asking for money for more test wells to make sure that we accurately set the basin.
Yes, absolutely. It's not a monolith, and actually
That's what I thought.
the data showed there's a lot more complexity and things that we're surprised about once we gather more data. And that's kind of the dilemma. I think it's a positive dilemma we have where we've had a lot of agencies taking a look at groundwater sustainability for a long time. So we have a lot of data and a lot of interest where a lot of agencies going into Sigma started from nothing.
Yeah,
They
Butte
had-
County's ahead of the curve, for
So
sure.
it kind of is our dilemma. We have some data and we know what additional data we want. And, it's just going to continue.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I've got one more.
All right.
I was at a seminar, and somebody from Aqua Alliance showed a graph of the aquifer, and they mentioned there a large agricultural well east of Chico. What county would that be? Was that Glenn or? Anyway, east of Chico, and he was saying that they did a test of where, because as they were drawing water, it was refilling. And they did a test of where that water was coming from, and it was coming from Chico. And so the water was moving east. And
West.
I'd just be interested in knowing just how water is moving and, when it goes down in one area, what other areas it affects.
That's what
So,
we're doing.
yeah, we'll be addressing that when we bring the interbasin coordination in to show in between basins. And, where you have groundwater dependency, that is going to draw groundwater. And the Sac Valley is pretty much all interconnected. The water doesn't follow political boundaries. So, we're all sort of in this together.
Yeah.
Yep.
Any public comment? Nobody already asked, right? So, moving right along.
Do you have another,
It's one last one.
was it on that?
Yeah, it was the same. That's probably it. Okay, and this will be brief. Spoke at the last meeting about the process and requirements for project and management actions. And again, this is, we can set the basin wherever we want, but the plan's not going to be sufficient if we don't demonstrate the means of achieving that. So it has to be coupled with a real demonstrated practical means of achieving your stated goals. And they can run the range of regulatory, non-regulatory actions. Some may not be ready for 5 years out with a schedule. There may be some that we have that, may not pan out and we have to drop over time. We may replace it with others, or as circumstances change, we may need to adjust what those project management actions, but we do need to identify those aspects. So we started to compile some of the options that have been, or some of the project management actions that other GSAs have put into their plans. That's, I think, one of the advantages that we have, not being a critically overdrafted basin. They had to submit their plan last January. So we have at least examples of what types of concepts people have brought in. So we'll start the process scoping out some of those aspects and come up with, in the end, a matrix of the ones we're planning on doing, and those will get inserted into the plan. And also potential ones that look like they may not fully meet the requirements, but they may be developed over the next, 5-10 years or whatever that could get done. And then there may be some good ones that are conceptual that get brought up and may need some more fleshing out over time, and we would like to capture those, because if planned ones fall off, they don't work out, or they're not achieving, or we don't get funding or whatever, we may want to bring up some of these other ones. In the end, if they're good projects that have good benefit, and it goes beyond what we need for sustainability, that would be a good thing too. So the schedule is October. We'll come in with some concepts, general types of concepts of the types of projects and actions that have been brought up for concepts. We're planning on having a public workshop in November, probably in a webinar format, to go over the requirements, some of the concepts, and solicit some public input on ideas, things that people may like, some things they may not like, and other concepts we haven't thought of. And that's usually where we get a lot of the best ideas, is the people out who are experiencing this thing firsthand. We'll have a discussion here in December with you on the results of the workshop and get your feedback and direction. And in January, too, we'll come back with something with hopefully a little bit filled out, and then go back out for public workshop and get some input, and then come April and June, start the process of having you okay the draft element of project and management actions. Again, all of those will remain draft, even the actions, until you adopt your final plan. So that's the schedule for that, and there may be things that we already have going on, like South Florida Water and Power got a grant to extend water line down to Palermo. Bringing surface water in could alleviate groundwater demand if it's replacing a groundwater source, and that could actually help with in some ag areas. We're also been talking to UC Davis Cooperative Extension researchers too on methodology to evaluate ag irrigation practices, and they've done surveys and studies on ag irrigation practices, on current practices, and adoption of the best practices, and identifying the barriers. So that may be an initial study to identify, how efficient are growers here, and what barriers do they experience for adoption. It might be cost, might be technology, might be unfamiliarity, and then we can adjust sort of getting resources to overcome those barriers and increase adoption of best practices. So those will be some of the things we'll be building into project and management actions. So with that, thank you.
Any public comment on this?
Mr. Chairperson, there has not been any public comment for this item.
Questions or comments?
No.
Thank you. Very thorough.
Yeah, all right, I don't have any. So we're going to move on to reports and communications. The Wyandotte Creek financial report was written. Does anybody have any questions about the financial report? Any public comment on the financial report?
Mr. Chairperson, I have not received any public comment on this item.
All right, we'll move on. Managing committee update. Kelly, gonna do it?
Yes, this is Kelly Peterson with Butte County. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, just real quick, I wanted to touch on a few things, including the Technical Support Services Program sponsored well installation. of the first monitoring well that will be installed into the Wyandotte Creek subbasin. And so that's been in process for a while. It's a great thing. And Bill, I heard you ask the question about how many wells we do have in that subbasin. Currently, we have about 10 wells in our monitoring network. The tricky thing about it sometimes is that if one of those is pumping or somebody's gate is locked or the dogs are out, sometimes we only get about 6 measurements with each trip. So it's a little bit touch and go with having that few of wells, but they are pretty well distributed. But this new monitoring well will actually fill a good data gap that is needed. So the draft design was just provided to us this week, and we had a conversation about that with the engineers and DWR. And so the idea behind this is that they're going to really give us a lot of great information. They first go down about 1,000 feet in what's called an exploratory well drilling, and basically they're taking cuttings and creating what's called an E-log the entire way down. So we do have that understanding of what our soils look like and what the textures and stratigraphy look like as it's getting drilled down. And then from there, they choose really where the best areas are to be screened based on the information that they pull up and they find. So it's sort of a work in process out there. But currently, we're looking at potentially having 4 different specific areas screened so that we can understand water levels at these 4 different depths. And one of those, of course, will be looking at our shallow groundwater table to get an understanding of where that is, and that will help us in terms of being able to relate that to a lot of the domestic wells in the area. As it turns out, in this particular area, a deep well is really only about 300 to 400 feet. So you don't get a lot of really deep wells in this area. So it'll be interesting though, because we will, as they pull up information and have that, we'll have probably some deeper screening perforations beyond that as well too. So right now, what we're gonna do is get those designs finalized, and you guys could be expecting some land use agreements coming across the table for approval probably in the next couple of months after they go through legal review, final legal review, and signed off by all the parties. And I do have a couple other topics to touch on, but I'll stop there and see if there's any questions.
Questions or comments by the board?
No.
Any public comment?
I do not have any public comment on this item. It does look like Janet left a comment for Kelly to answer in the chat box of Teams.
Okay. Janet, do you want to verbalize it? Excuse me.
Yes, I was just wondering, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kelly, did you mention that the readings for all the wells could not, there's not always a follow-through due to owner not being home or pet distractions, and I was wondering if there was already a pre-arranged appointment system set up so that we can get full, accurate measurements for all wells.
That's a good question. Yeah, we do have access in terms of just a blanket access to be able to get onto the property and measure the well. So the landowner doesn't necessarily have to be home, but sometimes there are things that come up. So we have probably, I want to say over 100 wells that we monitor in a 5-day period. So it's a little unfeasible to actually schedule that kind of thing. But if we know they're problem wells, we do our best to reach out and try and get that handled as well as we can. But yeah, it does present problems.
All right, so let me piggyback off of that. Now, you had mentioned earlier in answer to Bill's question, there are 10 monitored wells.
There are currently, yes, 10 wells in our monitoring network.
And so we're able to get an account from each of those. There's not a problem.
Depending on the season and the year, those are the 10 that we try to attempt to get measurements from. And so depending on, sometimes there's things that come up like land ownership changes. Maybe they've rented out the house and haven't conveyed that to the new rental folks. And so there's just sometimes a lag in communication and that kind of thing that needs to get caught up on. But those are the 10 that we attempt to get to. And usually we get most of them, but there are times where there's, close to 6 that we're making out of the 10.
Good headway on. All right. Thank you, Kelly.
Sure thing.
Any other board questions? No. Got any questions out there? All right. Board recruitment update. Kelly.
Thanks, Bill. Real quick, if I could go back to the last item, I just had one other comment on the management committee update. Just wanted to let you guys know that the last month we talked about amending the JPA to include for other ways of outreach to the public besides a formal stakeholder advisory committee. And so those revisions are in process internally, and we're about to send those out for to our respective member agencies for their legal review. Once that's done and we come back to the table and everyone's had a chance to look at it, it'll come back to you guys for a recommendation, at which point it'll then go to the governing bodies of the respective member agencies. So the Board of Supervisors, the Orville Council, the Board of Directors at Thermalito, Water and Sewer, and then that'll get signed. So just giving you a quick update on that. That's all.
Okay. Any questions or comments? Any public comment on that?
Mr. Chairperson, I do not have any public comment on this item.
So that covers number 8? Is that what we're at?
Yes.
Anybody from the public showing interest in just talking in general?
Mr. Chairperson, I have not received any general public comments for this meeting.
All right. You guys want to talk out there in the public? We can listen to you, just can't take action. Well, we could illegally take action to see what happens, and nothing probably. But. All right, we're going to adjourn this meeting, and we'll schedule a meeting for next month. Meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all.